All right, it's up to you, Tom.
Thank you, Lou. And thanks to all who have joined us here in the room and in Zoom land. Go ahead, Scott, get rid of.
Okay. You can, want to pin yourself?
We don't need that sign.
Right. Got it. And you might want to only show yourself. You know how? Like this.
I'll let you do it.
Okay.
Well, while Scott is getting this computer right, a reminder, or if you're first-time visitors, there are restrooms straight down the hall on the left side.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you see whether that's it?
My plan is to speak for about 45 or 50 minutes. And then we'll open it up to questions here in the room and questions via the Q&A function through Zoom. That if I've said something that is truly confusing, at least those in the room, put up your hand and I'll try and clarify right away. That I think most people probably know me, or at least have encountered me before, but for any that haven't, a couple words of background may be helpful to provide perspective to what I'm going to say. I've been working in, on, and with China for now almost 60 years. That my career is closely intertwined with the modern history of U.S.-China relations. So I'm not an entirely objective commentator on a policy that I played a role in shaping, the engagement policy, and in executing during the years that I was in the State Department. For those of you who have read the article in the Great Decisions workbook by David Michael Lampton, those of us who know him refer to him as Mike. He's a classmate of mine going back 55 years, I guess. I think it's a very good article. I am not going to critique it or rehearse it. What I'm attempting to do this evening is to complement what he has provided by way of an overview history of the evolution of relations between the United States and China, how we have viewed one another, and some of the triggering and defining developments. But I will note that Mike's article, on the whole, has a pessimistic tone to it. That the pessimism, which is not his normal characteristic, but the pessimism rests on ideas of realpolitik in international relations, and I think primarily on an assessment of the domestic politics in the United States and in China. That the character of the relationship is in many ways a product of the politics in the respective countries and the instrumental uses of China or the United States in the other country in order to justify policy preferences and the actions that are taken. I think that will become clear. My less pessimistic outlook might be compared to Mark Twain's characterization of Wagner's music. He said, it's not nearly as bad as it sounds. And the US-China relationship, in my view, is not as bad as it is described almost every day in news broadcasts, by commentators, by a subset of academicians writing about the relationship. As I hope will make made clear in my talk, a part of that characterization reflects disappointment. Some of it reflects misunderstanding of the expectations and the objectives of US policy over the last 45 years. And some of it is intended to press officials in the United States and in China to do something, fix this relationship. It's the most important relationship in the world. It's going in a downward spiral, and it will get worse unless action is taken to make it reverse and become better again. I don't agree with any of that. And I hope I can convince you, or at least explain the reasons for my bottom line judgment. So what I'm going to do this evening is to divide my talk into a brief summary of the current state of play in the US-China relationship, talk about what shaped China's perceptions and policies, what shapes US policy and behavior with respect to China, and very briefly, what to expect. Where is this going? Whether one thinks it's in real trouble and headed to worse, or about to bottom out and turn around, or to persist in its current state for some time longer. But let me begin with an overview or a summary of US-China relations today. Much of the rhetoric is hyperbolic on both sides. It is, if you think it's bad on the US side, it's worse on the Chinese side, in describing both the other country and the state of the relationship. It reflects both of this hyperbole on both sides reflects exaggerated fears of the other country's intentions, but it also reflects the political utility to both governments of having a challenging rival or a competitor. This is, how do you jog the system to do things, to not be complacent? You need a bogeyman of some kind, or you need an incomparably great opportunity that must be seized. We're in a motivate people on both sides, justify policy prescriptions on both sides in terms of what is necessary to deal with the challenges posed by the hostile country on the other side of the Pacific. That the hyperbolic character also reflects just the proclivities of the media. You know, a dog bites man stories are not very interesting. We're on the verge of war over Taiwan, or Chinese arms sales to Russia to be used in Ukraine or other things. Pundits who want something to write about and get attention. Also, a lot of academics. And I'm clearly in the category of an academic China specialist, even though I spent 25 years as a government China specialist. And that is this is really important to me. This is really important to what I do. This is important to the things I care about. Therefore, it ought to be really of greatest importance to the United States administration or to the regime in Beijing. I say this because it really is important to remember that China and the United States are both global actors, that we are involved in developments around the globe, on every continent, at the United Nations, economic activities, military activities. So the bilateral relationship needs to be understood in the context of what Washington and Beijing are trying to do domestically and with third countries, and toward transnational issues, as well as toward the opposite government. Now, the prevailing narrative about China, as I indicated in my opening sentences, is pretty negative. Relations have never been worse. They're dangerously bad. They're spiraling downward. We're spiraling towards conflict that neither side wants, but is becoming more inevitable if we don't do something to fix the relationship, to put a floor under the relationship. In my view, all of these statements are overdrawn. They're exaggerated. They're not wrong. They're not crazy wrong. They're not wildly misconstrued, but they're overstated. And overstating them pushes it toward there's nothing you can do about it. And that's not a very good framework for actually tackling problems. China is a uniquely bipartisan issue in Washington and even outside of the Beltway. That it's one issue on which Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives basically agree. China's bad. China does bad things. Those bad things have adverse implications for United States interests and policy, and something needs to be done. That in January, after the new Republican leadership took office, established a House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Communist Party of China. That was approved overwhelmingly, an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote to establish that committee. And there are a couple of things worth noting beyond the bipartisan character of it. One is clearly they thought they were being very careful, even very clever, in the name. It's competition between the United States, and China, not the American people and the Chinese people. It's the United States and the Communist Party of China. Having spent so many years in Washington, I'm confident in my judgment, uninformed, but judgment, that this was done to signal to the people of China, we got no beef with you. Our beef is with your government and its actions and its policies. However that is heard by the people of China, it's certainly heard by the leadership of China. This is one more bit of evidence of the intention of the United States to effect regime change in China. That US policy is intended to weaken China militarily, undermine it economically, with the goal of achieving a color revolution or peaceful transformation of the regime in China. So even this thought it was being carefully crafted title on the US side is surely being read as hostile in Beijing and will be depicted to the Chinese people as a hostile, not a limited approach. A few weeks ago, the Senate and the House both passed resolutions, a consensus or a sense of the Congress, condemning, in quotes, the brazen Chinese spy balloon. It passed unanimously in both houses. At some level, it's a meaningless gesture, right? This is not legislation. It has no force of law behind it. It is a feel good, is a demonstrate to your constituents you did something. But the characterization of it is just one more brick in the wall that is being erected that demonstrates, not just to China, but to a lot of third countries, the strength of American hostility to all things China. I'll come back to the balloon in a little bit. The idea that we must fix the relationship was underscored by the way the balloon shot down off the coast of South Carolina was depicted. And I want to use that and compare that to the 2001 collision between a Chinese fighter and an American spy airplane over Hainan Island. That because the context makes a difference. That's why I went through the congressional unanimity. That in 2001, very briefly, what happened was an American lumbering EP-3 propeller-driven airplane of the kind that used to be based over at Moffett Field when it was a Navy facility, that flies in international water off the coast of China very frequently, triggering radars and looking for military installations and the like. The Chinese come up to intercept them and often have behaved before 2001 and recently rather recklessly. And one pilot in particular got quite a reputation for being a hot dogger, reckless. And he misjudged this time. He clipped the Navy airplane. His plane went down and he died. The American plane was severely crippled. It is amazing that the pilot managed to bring it down with a crew of 24. On Hainan Island, that all of the crew members were safe. The plane was unfixable, unflyable. But we had a problem. This is in the first weeks of the George W. Bush administration. Very few officials had been confirmed. Secretary Powell handed this to me. He said, "You handle this." I reminded him, boss, that I had a day job, that he knew me as a China guy in the Bush 41 administration, beginning of Carter administration. I'd been doing 192 other countries in the time since I'd worked with him, but he said, "I know you and I trust you. So you've got it." I worked with the person who actually should have had responsibility for it. But here the context was the relationship between the United States and China was okay. That with strong support from the US business community, the US was leading the charge to have China admitted later in the year to the World Trade Organization, academic exchanges, non-governmental organizations, professional associations, collaborative research, all of these things were growing and quite positive. It was against that context that we made 3 decisions very quickly. This was an accident. This was not a deliberate provocation intended to test the new administration. The second judgment was the Chinese wanted to solve this. They didn't want to use this for leverage to try and get agreement on a series of other contentious issues. They wanted to get past this before it messed up the relationship with the new US administration. And the third judgment, also relevant to today, was that the president at the time, Jiang Zemin, the head of the Communist Party, had been misinformed before making the highly critical, blaming the United States statements that he did. And that he had been misinformed, willfully or unintentionally, and that we had to get to him before he said more things that make it harder to resolve, which we did. Things very different this year with the balloon. The relationship is bad. It's thought to be worse than it is. The Congress being unified in looking for evidence that China does bad things, leaning on the administration to do something about it. You recall in the very first days after it was spotted over Montana, it had actually been spotted over the Aleutians. The U.S. government knew where it was, but it didn't want to have to contend with the political pressure and the public attention. But the "why didn't you shoot this down yesterday" pressures, characterizing it as a spy balloon, hyping that into why would they be spying on missile bases in Montana? Maybe they're getting ready to invade or attack the United States, or maybe they're going to attack Taiwan. It spiraled into fantasy land very quickly on it. Now, what I think I know about it from public media and from having worked on China for a long time and been the deputy director of national intelligence, this was a spy balloon of a kind that they fly semi-regularly over Guam and Hawaii. So I'm sure we will confirm when they look through all the equipment in the payload. This was collecting signals. This was taking photography, but it wasn't intended to be over the continental United States. That they launched it. They have minimal control. As Heinz Erzberger has pointed out, aeronautical engineer, it was really a dirigible, not a balloon, because it was steerable. That the same unexpected winds that brought snow to Los Angeles hills, and the amounts of rain to us, took this balloon way off course. And once it got up in these strong winds, there was very little control of it. The Chinese very first statements, now they were late, they should have said something as soon as they realized it was going over Alaska. They didn't. But after the balloon was detected, they said this is a weather balloon for other research, and it went there accidentally. They used language that was actually very similar to the language that we crafted in 2001, where we expressed regret for the death of the pilot and apologized because our plane crash landed on their airfield without waiting for permission to land. That they said Mayday, Mayday, and hit the earth, but they did not get permission. So the Chinese tried to contain this. The domestic atmosphere in the US made that impossible. And the Chinese explanation was construed as lying. They were lying, but in a way that was different from the characterization. Let me take this and put it, the balloon in the international context, the American context, into the international context. Yeah, that both of us are playing in that broader global arena all the time. And what else is going on while the balloon episode is playing out? One obvious one is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. China's declared friendship without limits between Xi and Putin, between China and Russia. Reports of Russian requests for arms from China, reports publicized by the Biden administration of Chinese thinking about providing arms. The mere fact, this is not a trivial fact, but the mere fact of the heavy U.S. commitment to Ukraine, U.S. attention to holding together the Western coalition, NATO plus, to maintain support for Ukraine. The Biden administration doesn't need another big problem. It doesn't need a worse conflict, political, economic or worse with China. China, for reasons I'll make clear in a few minutes, doesn't want a bad relationship with the United States, but working through the problems is complicated by the other things going on. Two other things to bear in mind about what the things going on. One are changes in the global system. When China began its economic growth and rise by participating in the export-led growth economy facilitated by the rules-based international order, facilitated by the United States and its allies, it had no competition. There were no other countries where countries could go for large pools of cheap labor, for efficient infrastructure as the Chinese built. Now, China's success at taking advantage of the opportunities of international economic system, there are dozens of countries doing the same thing that China did in terms of attempting to grow through taking places in multinational production and supply chains, using international capital to develop technologies to be competitive, but more importantly, to be links in a multinational arrangement. So as a relationship with the US is bad, there are opportunities elsewhere. Not just American companies, not just other foreign companies, but Chinese companies are looking beyond China for alternative sources of labor, to diversify production chains, to avoid the vulnerabilities, bottlenecks in single source production. So companies are going, if they're not leaving China, they're not putting the next round of investment in China, they're going elsewhere. And China was very attractive. When it started, had about 1 billion people, now about 1.4 billion. But now India is opened up, that's 1.4 billion people. Southeast Asia has opened up, not so big, but 800 million people. That'll keep you busy for a while. So things are happening for economic reasons, mostly by private sector decisions that are only tangentially influenced by government policy, again, on both countries. And both countries are engaged with, give or take, all other countries. So those third country concerns about the state of US-China relations, nobody wants to be caught in the middle. Nobody wants to be forced to choose. For those that share values, Western Europe, South Korea, Japan, somebody should please mute their microphone. That Ukraine shapes their thinking, but a lot of them also have extensive economic and technology relationships with the United States or economic relationships with China. And they don't want things to get too bad. But they also don't want relations between the United States and China to get too good. Because if you're a mid-sized or a little country, part of the way you pursue your interest is playing one big guy against another big guy. If the two big guys form a G2, they got nowhere to go. So that's scary to them. So they, at the one hand, are don't fight, don't fight, don't fight. And on the other hand, will stoke it and poke along the way. And both sides have to manage that. Even more importantly, both sides are both pushed and constrained by domestic constituencies and domestic developments, which sets the priorities and shapes policies. And I'll try to demonstrate that for both countries. Before switching to what shapes China, make clear my judgment that though China is important to the United States, the United States is a lot more important to China. That For China, managing this relationship is more difficult, more challenging, and more important than it is for the United States. I hope this becomes clearer. But the asymmetry is a factor in explaining why there is not the response that some of the pundits and some politicians expect to the pleas to, you got to fix this relationship. And it's the Americans that need to take the first step. The Americans have greater capacity to fix things, even if we don't have greater blame for the problem. But it's less important to Washington than it is to Beijing. Let me turn to what shapes PRC policies towards the U.S. Again, context. That the world and the Chinese public, and certainly the rhetoric in the United States, depicts China as already strong, as still rising, as an unstoppable juggernaut, with the intention to remake the international system and displace the United States from its preeminent position. Chinese leaders don't see it that way. They see their country, their regime, their economy as fragile and vulnerable. Vulnerable to breakdown economically, social stability-wise, and vulnerable to interference by outsiders, first and foremost the United States. And the American imputed ability to persuade other countries, our allies, to do things to take advantage of China's vulnerabilities. It's pretty scary if you're sitting in Beijing. It's driven by fear, by worst case kind of projections about what needs to be done, an acute awareness of their own weaknesses, that they know that most of the legitimacy of the regime is based on performance, is based on steady growth, is based on being able to meet the escalating needs and demands and expectations of a population that now is 70% of an age to have known nothing except steady growth, increasing opportunity. But that steady growth has plateaued and then declined. And it's been going down now for a dozen years. Poor countries see China as a rich uncle, right? Be nice to the rich uncle and he'll invest. He'll build infrastructure. He'll do things we want. Maybe it's clearest in Africa, which sees another foreigner with a fat wallet come looking for opportunities and prepared to sweeten the pot, or to invest in areas that have been deemed not economically viable, can't get commercial funding. The Chinese public is pretty nationalistic because of education, the propaganda system, the victimization narrative, 100 years of humiliation, going back to the Opium War of 1840, that didn't end in this narrative until the Chinese Communist Party took over in 1949. It's a very strange narrative, but this public that has experienced nothing but steady growth doesn't see why China should take any crap from anybody. Be kicked around by the Vietnamese, be challenged by Philippines, and even the United States. Why would they put up with crap? And that is pressure on the government. And this was very clear when Nancy Pelosi made her visit to Taiwan, and the way in which China overreacted to that with the large military exercises, missile tests into Japanese waters. That if people are interested in the question period, I can explain why, but more about it. But this was really a bunch of counterproductive moves which was interpreted by the youthful Chinese population on their social media as wimping out. Said Beijing made all of these big threats, strong announcements of what it would do, and it wimped out. It just did military exercises, didn't shoot down an airplane, it didn't launch an attack on China. And it's easy to laugh at this, but you don't laugh at it if you're a leader in Beijing worried about public demonstrations, telling the regime that it should have done more to defend China's rightful position. That the challenges that China sees are viewed through a lens of vulnerability, of imputed hostility to outsiders, and awareness of a volatile public that, if disappointed by regime performance, will take to the streets. We saw that for a while in November, the so-called blank paper demonstrations. They held up blank placards. So, what are you going to arrest me for? I didn't say anything. There's no demand on it. It's a blank piece of paper. But a demonstration for or against anything could morph into criticisms of, why don't we have safe water? Why don't we have safe food, clean air? What about corruption? You've been rooting out corruption for decades and it's still bad. And they don't want to go there. So the current strategy that China pursues, it dates from about 2008, 2009, is based on this kind of conception of what their internal and external situation is. I dated from this period because that's when China's era of miracle growth ends. It had been growing at double digits for 35 plus years. In 2007, it grew at more than 14%. It leveled off. Last year, it was 3.3%. Their projections, outsiders' projections, World Bank projections, they're going to be lucky if they can hang on to 2 to 3% for the foreseeable future. You can do a whole lot less when you're growing at 3% than when you're growing at 10% in terms of resources. And the demands are going up. So they're going to have fewer resources to meet escalating public demands. This also puts the performance basis of legitimacy at risk. The implicit compact between the regime and the people is, we'll improve your material well-being and your social well-being, better health, better education, better jobs, higher paying jobs, more housing. In exchange, you let us run the country. You don't ask for a voice in the political system. You don't hold us responsible because we are representing all of you. That vulnerability as growth slows is real and is compounded by perception that the US has become more dangerous. And that dates from the global financial crisis, 2008, which was misinterpreted in Beijing and other places as clear evidence that the United States had gone into terminal decline. If we're going into terminal decline, China's rising, the Americans are declining. They mirror imaged. If they were the most powerful country and somebody else was climbing up the mountain, they'd do everything they could to keep somebody else from getting up there. The assumption is the Americans will do everything that Washington thinks necessary to contain, constrain, to thwart China's rise, including exploiting its economic vulnerabilities, exploiting its social vulnerabilities, forcing it into an arms race, and maybe even using military power. These are not crazy judgments. I have to think they're wrong, but they're not irrational. And it's shaped the policies with a number of elements to them, and I'll touch on them very briefly. One is, how do you deal with the Americans as a greater threat? From 1978, 79 until about 2010, dealing with the putative threat from the United States by embracing us, by giving us a stake in their economic performance. For as long as the Cold War persisted, by joining us against a common enemy in Moscow. That common enemy goes away in 1991. So why would the Americans stick with them? So the strategic answer is for China to draw closer to Moscow. So you got another big power to remind the Americans not to push too hard, not to meddle too much. Certainly don't do anything militarily, because we got another big nuclear power on our side. And in 2010, they elevate the relationship with Moscow and elevate it further last year to the friendship without limits. Draw closer to Europe. To use European economic power and Japanese economic strength to counter American economic and technological strength. To be able to use competitive capitalist calculations of Europeans to limit American efforts to undercut, putative efforts to undercut their economy. They hadn't thought it through, that aligning with Russia was not conducive to a better relationship with Europe. And after Putin invaded Ukraine, it really pulled the skids out from under the Chinese efforts to improve relations with Europe. China had aligned with the source of instability, the biggest war in Europe since World War II. Modernize its military. China had been modernizing its military since the early 90s because it had the money to do it, and because they'd watched on TV the wars in the Middle East, the wars in first and second wars in Iraq, the precision munitions, and realized they had a big military with no power. And after 2 decades of building up, they've got a very formidable military that now has more ships in the Navy than we do. Now, they're not nearly as formidable, but there are more of them. Expanding its nuclear inventory. And the US sees it. The politics of it, you can't ignore that China is building up, and the allies of the United States that say, what are you going to do in response to the Chinese naval buildup that is putting more pressure on countries around the South China Sea, interfering with fishing boats, interfering with other things. So the policies were based on false premises about the United States, false expectations about what Russia would do, and mistaken appreciation for the importance of values within the, call it the Western alliance structure. It's not just about defensive military alliances, the defense of democracy, the defense of rules-based order has meaning. Let me shift more briefly to what shapes US policies. And I'll be brief because I think you can see the logic that I'm applying in context. American public has run out of appreciation for understanding of tolerance for policies put in place right after World War II. Cold War policies that can be summarized as the United States would use its military power to defend others, maintain global security, maintain global stability, to create an environment in which trade and economic interdependence can build both prosperity and peace. That was the logic of it. The other part of it was using our economic power to strengthen others, to make our partners stronger. The idea of a strong and prosperous partner made the alliance stronger, which made the United States more secure, and a rich partner buys more than a poor partner. So they get more prosperous, we get more prosperous. In 1979, China was invited to come into that free world structure. It was the only non-ally, non-democracy country that was sort of invited into the club. It was on the assumption that the Cold War would go on forever. Better to have China as a strong partner than a weak partner. Yes, China got much more wealthy. So did we. The magnitude of increase in per capita income in the United States is much greater than it is in China. China goes up fast in percentage terms because it started from $300 a year. But in terms of actual dollar amounts per year, the US has done far better at it. American public basically says Cold War has been over since 1991. Why are we still having this free riders on security, and others get access to the United States that we don't have there? It was true globally. It's been centered, the criticism of the policy, on China. Not simply because it's a communist regime, not simply because it does specific actions, but because it's so bloody big. That little countries sort of stole intellectual property and pirated goods and that kind of thing. It really didn't matter. The size of their domestic market, we could have access or not have access. China is an entirely different creature here. It's so big. And it's also more competent. It's a well-governed, not like aspects of its governance, but it works better than a lot of countries. So it becomes the symbol for dissatisfaction with policy more broadly. Nobody said we should stop this policy because it's advantageous to the South Koreans. And why do we have an alliance with it? We should stop this policy because the Chinese are taking advantage of it. That logic. Jobs lost to globalization, to automation. That's not the way it's described. The Chinese stole American jobs. Think about that for a minute. Why did jobs move? Because largely American boards of directors made a decision to honor their fiduciary obligations to shareholders to maximize profits, and they decided they could do that by going overseas when China was the only game in town. So it's a push from the United States, not a pull from China on some of this. But you'll look hard before you find an American businessman or an American politician that says the jobs left because American companies decided it was economically advantageous. So it complicates the China is bad issue. The US military, I mentioned the Chinese buildup, which is real, but the United States, after fighting 2 decades, and burning up a tremendous amount of military equipment in Afghanistan and Iraq, we've got to rebuild the military. Americans, for some reason, think we're poor and don't want to be taxed. But we've got $1 trillion a year defense budget. When you add the Defense Department plus Veterans Affairs, which in other countries is all part of the defense budget, it's $1 trillion. You need an adversary that is worthy of that kind of expense. It's the largest component of the federal budget. So you justify it with the threat from China. And the equipment that you build against the most formidable opponent. The United States isn't going to rebuild the military to deal with Lebanon or Malawi. It's going to deal with China and Russia. So it describes in our strategic doctrines the need to address the challenges. The Chinese do exactly the same thing. They're building against us. If we can deal with them, we can deal with anybody. If they can deal with us, they can deal with anybody. This is a logical thing to do. I mentioned the Americans think we're poor. The astonishing lack of confidence in our system, not just the political system, but a whole system that sort of has emerged over the last decade or so. So why is China a problem? Because we're a problem. We seem to think it's easier to hold back China than it is to put our house in order with education, with healthcare, with advanced training, with infrastructure, and so forth. How do we justify kind of the belated but very necessary steps to fix the Eisenhower era infrastructure, to improve the status of education, to prepare people for tomorrow's jobs, and many, many other social justice things that we need to do? We're doing it with the 21st century equivalent of the response to Sputnik. For those who are old enough to remember, we had to do all of this to save our country after the Soviets launched the Sputnik. We have to have early childhood education for all American children to meet the China threat. I'm not sure what the China threat has to do with it. We ought to improve early childhood education. We ought to improve access to healthcare in rural areas. How do we justify contentious and costly programs in this country? Some threat. And that threat for now is China. I'm going to bring this back and close with the point I made earlier about US being more important to China than China is to the United States. That the demands or importunings to Biden administration to fix the relationship with China, by and large, I think fall on deaf ears, not because he doesn't care, not because the administration is obtuse, but because he's got a very ambitious and complex agenda of things he thinks need to be done. I happen to agree with it, in order to make America competitive, not just for China, but for everybody else, and more importantly, to continue to meet the needs and expectations of American citizens. He has de facto decided that using his political capital, setting his policy priorities to make America stronger again, to increase our competitiveness, doing it in ways I find don't appeal to me, industrial policy being one of them, but it's a logical approach. Fixing the relationship with our allies and partners, in part because they can play a role in meeting the domestic developmental objectives. that takes most of the air in the room. That takes most of the political capital to work that. Fixing the relationship with China would require an enormous expenditure of political capital to go against the unanimous judgments in the Congress that he needs on other things, that China is bad. So the choice is, do you use a whole lot of political capital and effort to fix a relationship with China that experience has shown, not just to Biden, certainly to me, that the conditions that China has set to reassure it, to build trust, to then move ahead and cooperate on other policies, the chance of actually being able to do that is so small. Why would you expend a lot of capital that's going to cost you the ability to deal with social justice issues, to deal with criminal justice issues, and many, many other things on the agenda? And he's making to me, the prudent political decision to not. Now, is that too bad that it leaves U.S.-China relations sort of in this uncomfortable, uneasy, in some ways restrictive sense? Yeah, it is. But the U.S. policy is, the slogan is compete economically, compete militarily, compete politically around the world on a level playing field, rules-based competition. Counter China when necessary, if it acts in ways that are disruptive to the international system, which is partly a reiteration of deterrence. Don't mess with Taiwan, kind of message. And most importantly of all, cooperate where we can. And this is an American, not simply Biden approach. It's work issue by issue, work problem by problem, build trust, build experience by working together on specific issues and problems. That's how you build trust and strengthen the relationship at the top. Chinese have a different approach. It's you got to get trust at the top, and then you get authority for lower levels to work on individual problems. Right now, we're stuck. It's looked like Xi Jinping in Bali, Indonesia, a few months ago, signaled a willingness to resume these low-level and not so low-level talks. When Secretary of State Antony Blinken was scheduled to go to Beijing before the balloon incident, I think a primary purpose was to probe that. Where exactly global warming, sea level rise, proliferation of nuclear weapons, terrorism, best practices in getting energy efficiency, whatever it is. So we've got hundreds of things on our list. Chinese have just as many on their list where we might actually talk together. But the balloon incident, which I think started as a runaway and accidental, unfortunate trajectory of this balloon that inflamed passions on both sides and made it politically harder to move ahead. Let me stop there so I've got time to respond to questions here. And Lou, I'll call upon you in a minute for the Zoomland questions. So if you have a question here, Scott's got a microphone so we can make sure the Zoom people hear it.
Hi, my name is Ian Aitchison.
Mhm. Good to see you, Ian.
Sorry. I think we have to ask, why is there this bipartisan unanimity?
I think
And it seems to me that there are two obvious reasons.
Mhm.
One is the kind of visceral hatred of communism. In other words, it's to do with value. communism versus so-called democracy.
Mhm.
Another is a challenge, perceived challenge to American dominance. These are real things. One of them, the dominance of America, is plainly a real thing with 800 foreign bases, etc. But I would like to suggest that the hatred of communism, which I also picked up in, as you mentioned, the House committee, was this government policy versus Communist Party. I'd like to suggest that it's wrong to demonize another system of government. I think one should be concerned with the welfare of the people of that country. One should look at results. As you said, the government of China depends on results. It always has.
Mhm.
Its legitimacy is coming from results. And I think we should be content to leave it at that. If they have a system and tradition that runs the way it does, and as you even said, it works actually pretty well on the whole. Why is that not good enough? Why do we have to demonize communism, which is, of course, really their government is not communist anymore, most senses, capitalist. And why do we have to privilege our system, which has many imperfections? It's ours, and they have theirs. Why can't we leave it at that?
I don't have a problem with the détente prescription. It's up to the people of China to decide what kind of system they want and deal with it, not up to us to decide. But I think in addition, and I think more important than the two reasons that you began with, the democracy versus autocracy mantra that this administration uses, I personally don't find that very helpful. The other is preserve American hegemony. I actually don't think that is a high priority for most policymakers, but it rhetorically, we can never be number two. The Chinese never say they want to be number one. They want to return to their rightful place in the world. Nobody aspires to be number two, right? That if you're going to mobilize and rationalize, and you've got politicians, but the third one, and the one I think is more important, and I think in this respect, members of Congress reflect the views of constituents. And Chinese actions since 2009-10 have alienated essentially every single constituency in the United States that used to support stability, positive aspects of the relationship with China, first and foremost, the business community. That things that the Chinese did particularly after 2009, the thefts of intellectual property, the value of that theft, it roughly equates to the total value of legitimate US exports to China. We're talking $300 billion a year, according to the companies. Even if it's an exaggeration, it probably is, it's a lot of money. The business community for decades, after every presidential election, said to whoever won, your rhetoric is fine, you got to, but this anti-China stuff stops now. This is about real money. This is about relationships and investments that took a long time to put in place. And every president up to Donald Trump pretty quickly fell in line behind what were basically Jimmy Carter's policy towards China. That changed in the second Obama administration, with a business community that previously said, Don't politicize this. Don't make it harder to solve. We can deal with this in a commercial framework. We can deal with this economically. They metaphorically came to the government and said, we can't do this without jeopardizing our commercial interests. So you, government, you fix the problem for everybody. So if Hillary Clinton had won, she would have had to take it on. Obama ducked it because of the other things on his plate. It came to Trump, who did deal with it in a counterproductive and clumsy way. But it wasn't just the business, and the business community could say implicitly, don't forget who pays for politics in this country. So if you're a representative or a senator from any place, you can't get elected without the input of money coming out of the business community. But the Chinese alienated academics. They alienated NGOs. They alienated special interest groups, nurses, religious organizations, lawyers, because of crackdowns in part for domestic stability on their own people, but also on the terms in which foreigners could interact. And suddenly there are no real pillars underneath the relationship. We're running on inertia. The business community has figured out a way to work around the Trump tariffs, is back in the don't make this worse to politicians, but they're not pushing any longer for fixing the problem. And I think that's the biggest part of the dynamic, is to explain where we are, why we are where we are now. Another question in the room? Phyllis?
This whole thing about Taiwan just seems very complex to me. And the chip manufacturer there, the big one, and all the technology for that relates to what you're saying about that business. Can you just say more about the relationship?
Yeah.
with Taiwan?
The relationship with Taiwan has become more difficult than it's been for a long time. That decisions made at the beginning of the Korean War that put the United States into the Chinese Civil War, that the United States was perfectly prepared to see the communists take over Taiwan in 1950. That was the expectation, couldn't stop it, didn't have a reason to try and stop it. But when Stalin and Mao backed Kim Il-sung in the invasion of the South, this is in the context of the Cold War just beginning. This was a decision, had to draw a line and stop military aggression, expansion of the Soviet world by force. U.S. put the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. So the Taiwan war, Taiwan's status did not get resolved. We went through decades of, let's pretend this is a democratic regime. It wasn't. The nationalist regime on Taiwan, like the Communist Party on the mainland, was a party set up by the Comintern in Moscow. It was a Leninist party. That Washington, this is Tweedledum and Tweedledee, right? What's the difference in terms of interest to the United States? Korean War changed that. The relationship up to 1979. Recognition switched to the mainland. Taiwan had begun to change, but not very much. It really changes a decade later, becomes a much more open, much more democratic. It now ranks higher than the United States on the Freedom House ranking of democracy. And they get a better score than we do. So it's no longer a matter of indifference. What Ian mentioned, values. Values have entered into the calculus with respect to Taiwan. In 1979, when recognition was switched, the US refused the mainland condition of severing all relations with Taiwan. We didn't need the military stuff. That was easy. We didn't need the official ties, but we didn't want to hurt the people of Taiwan by canceling things like recognition of marriage, recognition of wills, postal service, whole series of things that were preserved with omnibus legislation. Over the last 2 decades, Taiwan has become the poster child for transitions from authoritarian military-dominated regimes to democracy and open market economies. It's done what American policy has attempted to do around the world. So now there's even less stomach for doing anything that punishes, not just because of Taiwan, although that's big enough importance, but it's, again, playing the world stage, the impact on other countries. Just to close with all of this hype about the prospect of Beijing taking advantage of preoccupation with the war in Ukraine to attack Taiwan, I think that's nuts. That's not going to happen. That Beijing, again, its biggest concern is the economy. They've seen the ability of the United States and the Europeans and Japan and Switzerland, for God's sakes, jumping in here with sanctions. Those sanctions and willingness to put secondary sanctions on would absolutely cripple China's. It would cripple China's economy. So they're being very careful about what they do. They're very happy to buy discounted oil from Russia. They're willing to sell consumer goods and stuff through third countries. And let's pretend we send it to Turkey and it's going to Russia. They're not willing to do armed. And if they learn nothing from Ukraine, look, the trouble that the Russian military has having marched across a line on the map, it's going to be many times more difficult to cross 100 miles of water. And what they've learned from Ukraine is the Russian-style equipment and tactics that they have and they use isn't doing so well against the advanced armament, even the, call it the simple stuff that the West has been willing to provide to Ukraine and is now providing to Taiwan, that it's just much too risky in terms of the ability of the regime to stay in power. So I'm not worried about them attacking in the near term. Lou, let's go to you. And well, we'll hold the microphone again, we'll hand mic against the speaker here, so we'll hear you.
Okay, first of all, some higher level questions, 2 parts. In what way is China communist? It has a capitalist economy like the US. It's ruled by one party and autocratic like Islamic Iran. It has domestic social programs like Sweden. So what is communism and what is communism in China?
Did everybody hear the question? So I don't need to repeat it in here. Thank you, Lou. That the simple answer is it is ruled by a self-proclaimed communist party. And it subscribes to Marxist, Leninist ideology. It's not an outside judgment. That's what they proclaim. That's what they teach. That's what they hold political study sessions, which is rationale for the party state system, single party system. It's rationalized or justified as the most efficient way to modernize because they've got a plan. They don't have a planned economy anymore. They don't have a market capitalist system. They have a state capitalist system. There's not much of there is a market economy. There is a private sector, but there's no labor market, there's no land market, and there's no financial market. It's kind of hard to have a capitalist system if all of those things are controlled in some respect. So it's unlike the Cold War with the Soviet Union or with the Sino-Soviet bloc, the Soviet bloc with the Warsaw Pact states, that was both existential and ideological. That there's not a real ideological competition with China. I remember more than a decade ago in a conversation in Beijing, where policies kept changing and notions of what was socialist. This is socialism with Chinese characteristics. I said, what to you is socialism? What to you is communism? And the answer was, it's whatever we say it is this week. And we'll change the definition as it's necessary to sustain economic growth. So it is more excuse than rationale, that it is not a tiny little minority. Thereby, again, official numbers, there's 95 million members of the Communist Party of China. And that's not the relevant number. The relevant is how many family members benefit from, have some involvement by virtue of the family. So you multiply it by 4 or 5. That gives you a party that is larger than the total population of the United States. So to say this isn't representative of something, it is representative of a lot of people in it, but it's predicated on an ideology which justifies an economic and a political system which is strongly statist. Has been flexible enough over the last 40 years to adjust to sustain progress. I think it's bumping up against the limit of the possible on this, that as a private sector emerged, as the high tech, the moguls of it have emerged as potential competing sources of power, they had to be smacked down because the regime doesn't want alternatives in there. And one thing it has done very effectively over the last 70 years is eliminate any meaningful potential opposition. That the Chinese people perceive that the alternative to party rule is chaos, and putting at risk stability, putting at risk economic prosperity, putting at risk better future for their kids. So that's not very ideological. This is a justification for a system that they keep hoping to get a little more mileage out of it. I think they made a mistake when they backed off of reform in 2009, 2010, when they were doing very well and had a cushion to take risky changes, like an independent judiciary, like shifting resources away from the highly inefficient state enterprises. That the state enterprises in China have a profitability, a productivity of give or take 5 or 6%. The Chinese private sector is 13%. So they're starving the private sector for operating capital in order to privilege the state sector, because that's the pillar bureaucratically of the system. So preserving the system is at the expense of the future of the system. And that at some point, like the huge debt that they've run up, it's going to implode, I'm afraid. May have another one, Lou.
All righty, let's find it. Couple relative to Taiwan.
Mhm.
First of all, was it, this is three parts. Was it wise for Nancy Pelosi to go to Taiwan? What did she accomplish? And then the more general is the issue of the status of Taiwan is a continuation of the Chinese Civil War of 1949. The United States should stay out of the conflict. Do you agree with that assessment? I think you've already touched on this earlier, but those two things about Taiwan.
Yeah. Everybody heard that questions? That I didn't get very exercised about Speaker Pelosi going to Taiwan. You know, in the best of all possible worlds, she wouldn't have poked the beehive. She knew she was poking the beehive. Again, remember the context. 2022 was an election year. Speaker Pelosi represents a district in San Francisco that is pretty heavily Chinese. Where are the Chinese from? Taiwan. Taiwan is a poster child, as I said, for positive transformation. Not unreasonable that she would want to go. And I got to know and respect Speaker Pelosi before she was Speaker, that for a couple decades, I bumped heads with her because she'd call me up because of my jobs in the State Department to use as a foil. It's a hammer on human rights violations in China. And mostly she was right. She was always well prepared. I was put in a position of having to be China's lawyer and say, yes, it's terrible, but it's not as bad as it used to be. You know, it's going in a positive direction. So she represents her district. She knows her subject and appreciates what Taiwan has done in it. I think the mistake in misplaying it was not hers. It was the way China played it. They should have said, this is an 80-some-odd-year-old grandmother playing to her political constituents, probably going to be out of office after the election. Anyway, let's just cool. But they didn't. They used rhetoric that built it up. They got expectations of the public much higher. They did things that are clearly counterproductive. The military has wanted to run exercises, test dry run to see if they're ready to go to the island for a long time. Now they got the green light to do it. And every intelligence service in the world, including those of Taiwan and the United States, watched what they planned to do. They identified the weak spots. So did we in this. So whatever they'd been preparing for, then now everybody's preparing to counter it. And they did some really puzzling things. Like as a part of it, the closure to shoot missiles into Japanese territorial waters. Now, I'm sure they did it to remind Japan that it should not follow through on its political commitments of the last 2 years, that it would support Taiwan in the event of a military conflict with the mainland. But what it did was tip Japan to greatly increase its military budget. Japan entering into more military cooperation agreements with countries around the South China Sea. So it was totally counterproductive in terms of China's interest. They clearly didn't think it through. There's enough people that are smart enough to have recognized it, but where they were going, but it didn't help. And now undoubtedly Speaker McCarthy will go to Taiwan. because his Democratic predecessor went, because it panders to a different constituency in the United States, the Chinese will have to react and we'll have another problem in the relationship that doesn't need to be there. We do not belong in the Chinese Civil War. But the recurring problem of where do you start the clock? Taiwan has always been a part of China. No, not always. Became part of China when the Malay people that lived there got conquered. That when the Japanese occupied it after China lost the war in 1895, occupied it for a period, so it stopped being controlled by the mainland 130 years ago. That's longer ago than Panama separated from Colombia. When the US returned the Panama Canal, should we have given it to Colombia or given it to Panama? That where do you draw the line on time? And the Chinese, no surprise, like anybody else, pick a starting point that's convenient to their interest. But every year that goes past, and why Beijing is uncomfortable with this dragging on and on, the less logic there is to a historic justification. And they point to the Cairo Agreement, the end of World War II, where the great powers returned it to China, to the Republic of China, kind of ignoring that that's basically the same time as the Yalta Agreement, which the Russians have ignored in this. So if one set of agreements is still sacrosanct, but another one isn't, and you're backing the one that isn't, how does Beijing rationalize this on it? And with the passage of time, there's more. This is going to play out with things other than, this is not a U.S. unsinkable aircraft carrier. There's no motivation of that kind, despite Beijing's assertion that that's what this is all about. It's moved from, let's pretend it's a democracy and it's on our side, to shared values and interdependent mention of the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. This is hugely important to the global economy. In the event of a military attack on Taiwan, if Taiwan didn't blow that up, we would. I mean, it's just too valuable to have it captured in there. But it's incredibly sophisticated and incredibly interconnected to global production, truly global, that it's a player far beyond the size and the population of the island. Is there another question in the room? I'm right at 8:30, but I'll take one more.
Last year, you talked about this informal gathering of Australia, Japan, India.
The Quad, yes.
Quad, yeah. Yeah, what's happening with that, and how much the threat does China feel about that?
The Chinese don't say much about it now, and we don't say much about it. I'm sure they're having meetings. There may even.
Tom,
Yeah.
repeat the question, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you heard. The question was, what about the Quad? Last year in the Great
right.
Decision session, I mentioned the Australia, Japan, United States, and India grouping. What's happened was the question. And it's sort of dropped into the background. I think a reason that it is dropped into the background, again, preoccupation with other things. And India has proclaimed neutrality on Ukraine, is doing everything it can to take advantage of the availability of below market priced oil from Russia, because Russia is in a bind. It's dependent militarily on weaponry from Russia. on it. So one of the players in the Quad is not going to do things that can be construed as associating with the US-led anti-Russia coalition around Ukraine. And Ukraine is sucking up most of the oxygen in the room. That sort of doing things in the Pacific that don't have a specific short-term objective is not likely to get attention. We've reached the end. Lou, I thank you for handling the viewers on Zoom. I thank the Zoom audience for participating at a distance. Thank you all who are in the room. Thanks for the questions. The session next week is on war crimes. And our speaker will be Alan Weiner, who is a professor in the Stanford Law School and was a colleague of mine. He was in the State Department legal office. And he's been involved with the International Criminal Court, the Special Tribunal on Yugoslavia, doing crimes against humanity and war crimes. So he's not simply an academic who will be talking about that next week. And I hope to see everybody back. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to stop the recording now and then stop the session.